Good day, I'm Vincent Saxtetter, and this is the After the Age of Fire channel. This is episode 45, recorded on May 11th, 2026. The title Is World Economic Growth Today Fake Growth? Are we really growing as it seems, or is it in some sense fake, artificial? This is a prepping channel for you and for your family line to help you flourish and thrive and reproduce in the coming era. We're finishing an era of doublings every 22 years. For the last 250 years, the human race has doubled its consumption of energy and pretty much everything else. That means every generation had, averaging across the world's population, twice as much as the previous generation. And we're transitioning into an era where sometime soon we'll be in an era where we won't be doubling anymore and we'll be consuming a bit less. Right now we consume about 46,000 calories of energy from coal, gas, and oil. That's most of the 46,000, 90% of the 46,000 calories is from coal, gas, and oil. The other 10% or so is from what we call renewables. And in addition to that, we consume about 15,000 calories of food, fodder, and wood. So adding those together, about 60,000 calories. And in the coming era, it'll be closer to 30,000. If you want to review where that number comes from, just look at the first, say, episodes from 10 to 38 of this channel, in which I went over in detail all our energy sources, how much they cost, and the pros and cons, the difficulties of using them, and what it would be like to get all our energy from them instead of from coal, oil, and gas. But now we've left the first section, which was up until episode 38 of this channel, which was about the doublings, the exponential growth that we've been in, and about how much energy we'll be able to consume long term. And now we're in a new section, the second section of this channel's content, which is about the transition between the previous era of doublings and the coming era, and about how to recognize it and where are we in it. Have we already ended the era of doublings, or is it still continuing for another decade or two, or where are we in it, and how close are we to the coming era? This second section of the channel is more observational than predictive. I can't predict what the overall trajectory will be, except for that sooner or later we'll come down to somewhere around 30,000. So it's more about looking at what's going on around us, trying to understand it and how it fits together, and what it tells us about where we are in the transition. So there was one prediction, episode 39, said that this transition from the era of doublings to the coming era with 30,000 calories, half of the current consumption, won't occur overnight, at least not because of coal, oil, and gas running out. Mined resources don't run out in a year, or even in a day. They run out over generations. What'll be running out, there'll still be coal, oil, and gas in the ground, but it'll be much more expensive to get to than the easy oil, easy coal, and easy gas that we have available today. So on the other hand, how we run our affairs may change abruptly. So it could be that human behavior and history will intervene, and we might have a sharp drop in our energy consumption. But equally well, even if we have a sharp drop, we could have a rebound. Just like the stock market can crash, but it can also surge. But so that sort of thing can happen very quickly, but our resources, coal, oil, and gas, won't run out overnight. It'll take generations, maybe 25 years, to see a big change in the trends, and then maybe 50 years for the drop to really occur. And so your grandchildren will be most likely living in an era of reduced energy consumption. It won't be like 5 years from now unless we have some war or some economic crisis, which will be our fault, not because of what's in the ground. And then in episodes 43 and 44, in other words, in the previous two episodes before this one, there was a second prediction or observation, which is that we won't completely kill all of us. We might kill billions of ourselves using any of many different means that I listed, but we evidently don't have as a human race, we don't have the self-control required to get us all killed. And in fact, the previous episode 44, was a detailed discussion of nuclear war, what that would be like, how it would affect us, and who it would kill. So we could kill billions that way, but we can't kill us all. This episode is about a different topic. It's about looking at the economic growth that we seem to be living in right now, and asking, can we be sure that the growth we see today is real growth, or could it be fake? So overall, where we are, we've been historically, is where we've been through 250 years of doublings, and I like the analogy of a stunt biker, a motorcyclist going off a ramp pointed upward, and so he's going off the ramp, and at some point he goes off the ramp, and he's still going up, but he's in free fall. So for a while he's going up and up and up, going slower every minute, every second, until at some point he's going to turn around and come back down. So that's, maybe we're still on the ramp, maybe we're still accelerating in the doublings, or maybe we're past the doublings and still going up, apparently. But one thing's for certain is we're going to come back down, and we'll come down, not down to zero consumption, but down to something like 30,000 calories per person per day, about half of where we are now, or about the same amount of energy that the human race was using in 1970. Now, it seems a little bit odd, considering that the fundamental reasons why we can't consume long-term 30,000 calories, more than 30,000 calories per person per day, haven't changed, and they're not going to change. It's a little odd that we've gone past 30,000 calories, and right now we're at 60,000, and it certainly means that if we are at 60,000, sooner or later we'll come down. But it would have seemed a little more natural if the human race, encountering all the problems that go with energy use, had adjusted along the way, and it would have slowed down as it came near 30,000, and then stopped expanding. I don't know, that's certainly a scenario that seems natural. Maybe it's also natural that we would just go for broke like we have, and keep on expanding as fast as we could, as long as we could. But there's a question, why are we so far past, a factor of 2 higher than the long-term average? And then the question, natural riposte to that question, is maybe we're not really past that. Maybe the 60,000 calories that we're consuming today are not really giving the human race anything more than than the 30,000 calories that we were consuming in 1970. Maybe we're burning a lot more stuff, but somehow we're getting less in return for it. So maybe even though in terms of energy numbers we're using more, maybe we're not really better off. Maybe our economy, if you looked at it with a astute eye and carefully, would not actually be larger than it was in 1970. So maybe the things we consume are lower grade or ersatz. Maybe we're not getting more of the things that we need or care about. A bit like a modern store-bought tomato, which might be grown using hydroponic systems with no dirt, just some medium for the roots to stick in, and inside a greenhouse, and it looks like a tomato. It lasts longer than a normal tomato, but it doesn't taste like a tomato, and it's not nearly as nutritious as a tomato. It's plastic, effectively. Maybe the things we get now are far more ersatz, plastic, unreal than they were in 1970, or when we went past 30,000 calories. Maybe, and then another thing is maybe any gains that we may have made in the meantime in the last 50 some years might be more than canceled by increasing problems that the human race is experiencing. So maybe we just aren't taking into account the problems well, and so if you took into account the problems of our predicament right now, you might say, well, we haven't really made any headway. There are certainly ways to make things better than they are, look better than they are, and I think you can see that with the human body, and so I want to make an analogy to the human body. Okay, the fact is that our cells count down day by day our age, and or count up our age. There's nothing you can do changes the aging that your body undergoes. Your cells know your age, and your organs know your age, and it doesn't matter what you do. You're losing after you're 20 your eyesight and your muscle mass and everything out. Your hearing steadily degrades. You lose brain cells, and there's nothing you can do about it. But you can, through a number of measures, make it look to yourself and to others as if you were 20 years younger than you are, and you can live in a kind of fairyland where you never age. So a 40-year-old can make himself or herself look 20 years old, and a 60-year-old can make themselves look like they're 40 years old. That requires effort. If you don't take the effort, then anybody can tell pretty well your age within 5 years. I'm pretty sure of that. I know I can tell people's age within 5 years if they don't use makeup and they aren't trying to look different than their age. You could just read it in their face, and the way they hold their bodies and so on. And some of the tricks you could use is, first of all, you could be fatter than you need to be. Fat sort of creates an insulating layer around your face and your body that masks your wrinkles. You can also wear clothes that are younger than your age. You can wear makeup. You can go to the gym and try to use the gym to mask your age. You can get cosmetic surgery. Okay, if you do this sort of thing, okay, you look younger than you are. You may look like you're not aging. Your friends may look like they're not aging. You may feel that you're still more or less the same as you were when you were in your 20s. But the fact is you are aging, and the consequence is that when you finally do collapse, when your bladder gives out and you become incontinent, or you have a heart attack, or you have a stroke, or or any of a thousand other things, it'll be a bit of a surprise to you, and you and your friends and your family will not be adequately prepared. You may have known in theory that it was going to happen, but you were too busy living in your 20-year-old lifestyle to come to terms with the fact that it was about to come to an end. And I think the same thing can happen to the human race as a whole. We have been in an age of extraordinary growth, and we really want that growth to continue forever, indefinitely. And so we do all sorts of things to promote that growth and make it look like we're still growing just as dramatically as we did as we were 100 years ago. So I just want to discuss some of the ways that we do that. One of them is accepting lower grade, lower quality things as part of our way of life. So you may accept the grocery plastic tomato. You may accept factory produced bread instead of bread made by hand, by somebody at the local bakery, or even by someone in your own family. You may find, I think another thing, there's no substitute for having a cook at home, usually a woman, to do the cooking. No matter if you don't have someone who really devotes himself or herself to cooking in the home, you can spend as much as you want, and you just won't get as good value and as good food and as tasty food. So a chicken cooked by a housewife gives you far more and far tastier food than fast food chicken fillet sandwiches or chicken nuggets and things like that. And then there's how we treat our animals today. Right now we really force their growth and keep them in unfortunate conditions, and we feed them antibiotics and steroids and sex hormones to make them grow more quickly and not get sick. Then our homes, you look at a modern home, how it's constructed, and you compare that. Modern homes are constructed out of materials and with methods that are designed to fall apart in 50 years or less. And you look at an older home, and you find that every component is higher grade, higher quality, and it may be smaller, but it's better and it's longer lasting. If you have a thin veneer of pine now, well, 20 years ago it would have been solid pine, and 50 or 80 years ago would have been oak or something like that. Then there are all the things we buy today that can't be repaired. So you get something, but as soon as the plastic fan that if the blade breaks, there's nothing to do. You just throw it away. There's virtual school versus real school, and there's the modern customer service via chatbot compared to before that was 1-800 numbers, and before that there were real people on the line, and before that there were people you actually knew down the road at the store. And along the same lines, there's the franchises where you get artificial food that's been tuned to keep you coming back, and where the staff are more or less robots. They know their lines. They're told what their lines are to be and what their procedures are to be, and there's nobody there except for these franchise workers. So that's ways that we may get less than we think we're getting, less than we used to get. Another thing we do is we prop up our growth. We overspend. So we build too big. We build public works and and new highways, beltways around our cities that aren't needed. We build balloon houses bigger than ever, even though our families are smaller than ever. We build new suburbs, and people are forever selling their houses in an old suburb that's 40 years old and is busy degrading and moving to a new suburb. We demolish and rebuild buildings all the time, and we spend to stimulate the economy. In fact, we're often told that the patriotic thing to do is to spend more, to go shopping. There have been economic stimuluses over and over again. In the United States, there was a stimulus of 1977 and 2008, 2009, 2020, and 2021. In the EU, there was one in 2008. In China, there was one in 2008 and another in 2024. And there are many more. So just doing whatever you can to make it look like you're growing. Then there's the war spending. There's a never-ending succession of wars in the poor countries, and sponsored in part by the rich countries. The rich countries get richer because they're involved economically, but they don't. Nobody's wounded from the rich countries. They benefit, and the poor countries, their loss is just not accounted for, because their economies are close to zero anyway. So a decrease in an economy that is almost zero is still almost zero. No one keeps track of what the real consequences are, the real economic consequences for the future of the human race as far as these poor countries go. And so it all looks like the war is a net positive for the world economy. And in fact, in the United States, which spends about half of the world military spending as of 2022, close to half, and until recently, it was half or more than half of the world economic spending. The military industrial complex is a major part of the U.S. Economy, and a major driver of the U.S. economy. It really is very important to the United States wealth. Yeah. Then there's a question of public debt. In general, around the world, debt is growing faster than income. That's true for governments and nations, and it's also true for individuals. And when your debt grows faster than your income and continues to do that over decades, you must begin to wonder whether anybody expects to repay their debt. So in the USA, this is adjusting for inflation. The public debt, the government debt between 1980 and 2022, multiplied by 9, while the GDP, the gross domestic product, the amount of wealth or business or products that was being generated by the U.S. each year, multiplied by 3. So that means the debt multiplied 3 times faster than the GDP. So it's a huge difference. That means compared to the United States wealth or earning power, it had 3 times more debt. Again, this is taking into account inflation. And that is growing faster than GDP in all the major Western European countries, and in Canada, and in China, and in South Korea, and in Japan. In other words, all the rich countries. So in China in particular, between 2000 and 2022, the last 22 years, their debt multiplied by 20, and their GDP multiplied by only 6. So again, and in particular between 2008 and 2018, in those 10 years alone, Chinese debt tripled. So you may have heard that Asians are good at saving money, but it's beginning to change in a big way. In South Korea, between 1990 and 2022, the debt multiplied by 18, while the GDP multiplied by only 4. So a huge difference again. Then we talk about private debt, and in particular I'll talk about home ownership in the United States. In fact, perhaps it's not very well known, but in the late 1800s in the United States, renting residences, not buying them, was the norm. And in the 1900s, there began to be a trend toward owning houses instead of renting, but it never became a complete, dominant, absolutely dominant. There were still lots of renters. Of course, this owning wasn't quite owning in many cases, because very often it was done with mortgages, where as long as you still have your house mortgaged, which might be 30 years, at that time it might have been 30 years of being mortgaged. So in other words, if you buy your house when you're 25, it would be until you're close to retirement age before the mortgage is paid off, and during those 30 years, if you miss a payment or two, then the house is foreclosed on and belongs to the bank again. So it's not quite ownership. But at any rate, in the 1900s, this sort of mortgage scheme was relatively restrained, so that people who did own a house, or more, even whether with a mortgage, did tend to try to live within their means. So they tried to keep a balance between their mortgage payments, their other expenses, and their income, and that's what it meant to keep your books in order. All that changed around 1980. Between 1980 and 2008, the amount of housing debt in the United States divided by the GDP, so the housing debt divided by the total earning power or productive power of the United States, multiplied by 3.5. So there stopped being that link between what you could earn and how big of a house you bought. Now the cost of materials for houses stayed the same, but people steadily, the value of their houses went up and up and up, and their debt for their houses went up. And the cost of housing in the United States, Europe, and Japan, this is adjusting for inflation again, in those 28 years from 1980 to 2008, multiplied by 2. In the same period between 1980 and 2000, the stock market, you take the stock market, you divide it by the United States economy, its GDP, and it multiplied by 5. So before, the stock market had not been a dominant it had been a niche player in the United States economy. Most of the United States economy was about other things, okay, about products produced, but the stock market steadily began to have much more important place in the United States economy. There was what was called financialization. So many families and many people began to get more and more of their monthly and yearly income, not from earning anything, but instead from investments in the stock market or in real estate, expecting that their houses will increase their value far faster than inflation, or that their stock investments will do the same thing. And then when their house increases in value, we began to have methods for, instead of trying to pay off the house, of trying to get that value back and using it for your monthly and yearly expenses. So in fact, what's going on right now is that more and more families in the United States are instead of paying off their houses, they're gradually exhausting whatever the value of the house is, and effectively selling back the house or selling any value that it has to the banks bit by bit, and they're on track to exhaust all their assets before they die. So many families are actually, by using these financial tricks, which have become available, they're finding ways to spend faster than they earn and to run out of money before they die. In fact, we're moving back, the United States is moving back towards a rental model, and it's moving, almost all United States citizens are in debt by necessity. It's unavoidable to be in debt. If you, even if you did balance your books somehow, there would still be every once in a while that trip to the emergency room, which is not covered by any insurance plan, and will suddenly put you in $20,000 of debt. And so if debt is unavoidable, if all American citizens are in debt and there's no way to pay it off, it becomes a kind of slavery, something bordering on slavery, which is an issue I'll bring up in a couple episodes, not so much about U.S. slavery, but slavery in other countries. Modern slavery, which doesn't look quite the same as what we think of, say, from the colonial era, but does have many of the same basic dynamics. So in order to fuel spending and to allow this kind of living in debt, and in order to generally promote economic growth, there have been, from 2008 onwards, artificially low interest rates. The United States, there was an economic crisis in 2008, a world economic crisis, and the United States responded to that by trying to push the economy out of recession, and it did that by lowering its federal funds interest rate down to 0.1%. That means you pay, if you take out a loan, if you're able to take out a direct loan from the government, which this would be in billions of dollars, of course, but then if you take out $1,000 loan at that federal funds interest rate, then after a year you'd have to pay $1 of interest, which is effectively zero. Effectively, you could get money for nothing. Now consumers say, well, large companies, banks, and then would have to pay a few percent more than that, and then consumers have to pay a few percent more than that. Okay, so it's not exactly free, but it's very close to free. And that went on at least until 2022. I think there was a slight fluctuation upwards where the U.S. increased the interest rates by a few percent above zero between 2017 and 2019, and then it brought them back down. So this was a titanic effort that went on for 15 years to stimulate the economy, in both the United States economy and the world economy, by keeping interest rates low and by saying, you can get money basically for free. And it promoted a lot of spending by individuals and by every sort of entity. But so there have been huge efforts to promote growth, but it's very hard to actually get good economic growth. In fact, despite all the efforts to promote growth, our economic growth worldwide has slowed down. So from 1960 to 1980, the world economy was doubling every 16 years, roughly 6% per year. And then from 1980 to 2022, that's the last 42 years, and it slowed down to every the doubling rate was once every 24 years or so. So that would be more like 4%. So it's been a lot slower since 1980 until 2022. So looking at and in fact there's a trend that the rich countries grow slower than some of the poorer countries. So like Italy's doubling rate from 1980 to 22 was a doubling every 62 years. Japan, France, Brazil, and Germany were on track to double every 42 years. The UK and Spain every 33 years. The USA 27 years. Okay, so many of the rich countries of the world were doubling, at the rate of one doubling every 42 years or so. And then there were a few poorer countries that were doubling much more quickly, that were really expanding. India's doubling rate was once every 12 years from 1991 to 2022, and China's from 2000 to 2022 was doubling every 9 years. South Korea during the 1980s was doubling every 7 years, but it slowed down, and between 2010 and 2022 it's once every 26 years, so more like the United States. So I described to you briefly in the preceding 20 minutes some of the extreme measures that individuals and governments have been taking to promote growth and to overspend. And you have to wonder, if we hadn't been taking these extreme methods, these extreme measures, whether the rich countries might have, instead of growing very, very slowly, whether they might have gotten poorer. You also have to wonder, if we were to ever stop, say, keeping the interest rate way too low, or overspending on infrastructure, or rebuilding our homes, or building entirely new suburbs, or all the other things that we do. If we were to ever stop deliberately spending beyond our means, you might wonder whether we might lose the gains that we think we made in the last 30 years. It's very hard, and here you begin to wonder about, that's the main point that I've made so far, is I really wonder whether the economic growth that we see is not artificial, whether it's the real thing, and whether it might be there just because we've been pushing things along as hard as we can, and making stupid decisions as we go about, say, giving away money for free, or huge countries and individuals, every individual in a country going into debt, and so on, or choosing to live with shoddy houses and shoddy products, filling those houses and shoddy food that our ancestors 50 years ago didn't live with. And then I'd like to talk for a moment about inflation statistics, because when we say that the world economy grew, say, from 1980 to 2022, it had a 24-year doubling time. That means roughly 4%, around 4% growth per year, or we say that Japan's economic growth was growing once every 42 years, so that would be roughly 2.5% per year. That's in order to arrive at an estimate of real growth, you have to have an idea of how much the inflation was. If you because you subtract out the inflation from the growth rate. So if everything costs twice as much as it did last year, and if your economy seems to be twice as big as it was last year. Okay, so people are earning twice as much, but they're all also spending twice as much because inflation has gone up, then you haven't made any progress. Okay, in fact, that's zero economic growth. On the other hand, if everyone's earning twice as much, okay, but inflation has only gone up by 10%, okay, then that was almost all real economic growth. So it's very important to know how much inflation was. If you get the inflation number wrong, you'll get the economic growth number wrong. If you if you think that the economic growth is 4%, okay, before subtracting inflation, and you think inflation was 2%, that means you have a total economic growth of 2%. On the other hand, if you have that inflation number wrong and your inflation is actually 4%, then you have no economic growth. And if it's even more wrong and the real inflation was 6%, okay, then your economy is actually contracting and people getting poorer. So let's talk a little bit about how we get our inflation numbers, because then we can think a bit about how much we believe the numbers about how much the world and individual countries are growing. So the US dollar is really important to all of this, because at least until around now, the US dollar has been the linchpin of the international financial system. So when the US increased the federal funds rate decreased it to 0.1%, it wasn't just adjusting things in the United States, it was adjusting things worldwide. And similarly, when we think about inflation, everybody's always thinking about the cost of the income and the cost of goods in individual countries, but measured in dollars, US dollars. And there's always efforts to try to convert from whatever's going on in some particular country in one particular year to what it would be in US dollars. But anyway, so for that reason, what the US, how the inflation of the US dollar is crucial for our understanding of inflation worldwide and in all the countries worldwide. Anyway, the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is the arm of the government that keeps track of inflation in the United States and by proxy in the world, says that a 1980 dollar is worth 3.74 2022 dollars. So the value of a dollar divided by around 4 during those 42 years. Or another way of saying it is that $267 in 1980 are worth $1,000 in 2022, or that inflation was doubling, was dividing the value of the dollar by 1/2 every 21 years or so. I think you could argue and make a cogent and a founded argument that these inflation numbers are too small. That in fact a dollar today is worth less than you would think, based on the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. So in particular, one way to argue it would be if you adjust for inflation, the housing prices in the U.S. and Europe and Japan multiplied by 2 between 1980 and 2008, and they're continuing to increase since then. So a more than 2 multiplier from 1980 to 2022. That's after adjusting for inflation. So if you spent $133 in 1980 on a house, that would be the same as spending more than $1,000 in 2022. So you get much less house for your dollar today than you would think based on United States inflation estimates. Okay, it's off by more than a factor of 2. You're getting less than a half than you would think based on inflation. So if you said, okay, I'm not going to keep track, I don't think those those inflation numbers from the U.S. government are right. Instead, I'm going to look at the cost of a house, and I'm going to say that's a better measure of inflation. Then in other words, you're going to say the real value of a dollar is based on how many houses it can buy. Okay, then you would conclude that from 1980 to 2022, Japan, France, Brazil, and Germany's economies didn't expand at all. They were not growing. Okay, Italy's economy actually got smaller during those 42 years. The USA's economy was growing at a rate where instead of doubling every 27 years, its real growth was the one that would have it double every 75 years. It was, instead of being 4%, it was closer to 1%. The world's economic growth was not on track to double every 24 years. It was on track to double every 55 years. So maybe its economy was growing worldwide, but much slower at half the rate that you would think based on the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, in fact, it's probably worse than that, okay, because by now in the United States, people under 50 are basically not buying houses. They're just beyond the reach of an ordinary person under 50 years old. So, it's probably not really a factor of two difference in the actual price compared to income. It's probably much worse. Now, how could this be? How could the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics be so wrong about the inflation rate? Well, there are several ways that can go wrong, and I think it's unavoidable. I don't think they're really terribly at fault, and I'll tell you why. One problem is that, of course, it has to focus on something, on some particular spenders, consumers, to figure and say these are the people that it's going to measure inflation for, and it chooses to measure inflation for people in particular U.S. cities. Okay, it has to focus on places, and therefore it can't take in the U.S. as a whole, or even the world as a whole. Okay, it's stuck with, it has to focus, it has to make a decision about inflation in a particular place. It's trying to make it as general as possible, so say more than just one city, but and then it has to think about the cost of many things. There are many things whose prices change over the years, and it has to make some average of how the prices change of, say, a can of paint, and then also a liter of milk, and a children's bicycle, and then someone's education, and has to balance these out in some way. In its estimate of, and that's a judgment call, how you choose to do that, and then it has to compare the value of things in 1980 to value of things in 2022, even when they may be much different. An education in 1980 is much different than an education in 2022. Certainly, the one in 1980 was better. Okay, the healthcare has changed, and you have to think about, for instance, what's the value of healthcare with, say, some modern technology, but with doctors who are willing to see you for 2 minutes at a time and have no personal relationship with you in a clinic setting. Okay, maybe a hospital where the doctor gives you a total of 5 minutes of their day while you're inpatient. Okay, compared to how things were back in 1980. And then there's the difference in food items. How do you compare a strawberry today to a strawberry in 1980? How do you compare a computer today to the computers that didn't exist in 1980? How do you compare prefab furniture made out of pulp wood that as soon as it gets wet, it distorts and loses its strength, and you want to throw it away, to stuff made out of real wood in 1980? Okay. And so you have to make some comparisons there and make some judgments. It's very hard to do. And in response, any person, any agency that's trying to evaluate inflation year on year has to make changes in how they measure things, and the world situation and the local situation changes year by year, and they have to adjust. and they can't be consistent from year to year. And in fact, there will be small inconsistencies in method from year to year, and then there will be large changes in method every once in a while. So in the United States, there was a large change in the overall way of measuring inflation in 1998. And it went across the board, the full spectrum, and change in how they analyzed inflation. But in particular, if you look at how they chose to measure the cost of housing, before 1988, they were looking at housing prices. After 1998, they were trying to understand rental prices, because they thought that was more relevant to a representative family. And then the way that they decided to measure rental costs was some strange survey system where they would go and ask people, homeowners, if you wanted to rent this, how much would you rent it for? When in fact most of these homeowners have no idea because they aren't renting. So there's a guy named John Williams who says that he claims that if inflation were being measured today according to the pre-1998 standards, then we would see inflation numbers that were 7% higher than are reported today, and 7% repeated year on year, decade after decade, since 2000, just throws all the numbers off. The whole world would be in chronic recession, according to him, starting for the last 20 years. And I'm not saying whether he's right or wrong, or whether the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics is wrong. Okay, I think whatever you do to measure inflation, it requires a lot of thought. And the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics certainly has people who work really hard, think very carefully. It requires judgment calls. It requires a real scientific approach as much as possible. There is some pressure to underestimate inflation, but there's a lot of research, and it's possible to defend, to effectively argue for what the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics does, its methodology, and it has been defended, and there are lots of people who work hard to get it right. Okay, but no matter how much you work on it, it's still open to question. This is one of those things where there's no right answer. You have to make judgment calls. You have to focus on a particular place. You have, because some things, the way things are working in a particular city for a particular family may be completely different than how they're going for another city in another country, or even in the same country, or a different family. And it's impossible to be consistent from year to year. This is a changing world, and the products that we use in this changing world change. But so you can argue it many different ways, okay? And my main point here is that the value of the dollar that we talk about is not a real known thing. It's open for interpretation. When we say that the economy has expanded by a certain amount, that means we have made a decision to believe a certain number about what's happening with inflation, and that number is not set in stone. It's just something that a particular agency made a decision about using a particular set of judgment calls, and it speaks for it's trying to address particular concerns in a particular country, and there's no way this is going to work worldwide. And in particular, there's a strong possibility that inflation is higher and worldwide than we think, and that the world economic growth is smaller than we think. So I'm not saying I know what the economic growth is. I'm just saying nobody does. Also, I doubt, I think it's really not possible to keep track of wealth globally for decades all over the world globally. That means you have to know what the value of a dollar is here today compared to what it is a year from now. You have to do that year after year after year, even though after 50 years you're talking about products and people that are amazingly different than they were 50 years earlier. Okay, and you're comparing apples to oranges, and you also have to keep track of how much a dollar is worth here compared to to how much it's worth in China or in Myanmar, or any of those, any day, any year. And again, it's comparing apples to oranges. Instead, the best I think you can do is to have local measures of inflation and of wealth that address a particular region for a certain period of time, and then at some point you're going to have to make some adjustments and to compare to create a world-spanning system. You may have a little bit of success for some years, but it's not going to see you through, and really the more global you get, the worse things go. So therefore I think there's intrinsic uncertainty about who is growing and who is not. Trying to use a single number, the US dollar, to quantify everything and compare everything is not really a workable methodology in the end. I'll come back to this in another episode later on, but in the meantime, whether you buy that or not, the main point of this episode was that the growth that we think we're seeing and we've been seeing for the last decades may be artificial. It may exist only because we were making some foolish moves just to promote growth. It might disappear as soon as we run out of, say, the ability to print money. And also, it's not at all certain that the growth that we're seeing is actually as large as we say. It could be that the world economic growth is considerably smaller. If you would just adjust the inflation rates a tiny bit, inflation rates compound, they add up over the years, and a small difference in inflation rate can make a huge difference over 40 years in whether the world's economy is growing or not. It may be considerably slower in countries maybe in recession that believe that they're actually expanding. The whole world potentially could be in recession even though it thinks it's expanding. So with that, I wind up the episode, and I wish you a good week. In the next episode, I'll be talking about one particular way that this could work, that our growth might not be what we think it is. It's a geopolitical shell game. So a particular way that fake growth can work. So I wish you a wonderful week. If you know anybody who may be interested in this content, please encourage them to join in and listen and keep coming back.